While most Europeans in the first half of the 19th century referred to the native inhabitants of New Zealand as New Zealanders, the Maori text of the Treaty of Waitangi used the expression tangata Maori, ordinary people, to denote them. This indicates how Maori were referring to themselves by that time, and indeed, recorded evidence of that expression goes back as far as 1801 to the journal of the ship Royal Admiral in the Firth of Thames. By the 1830s, the word Maori on its own was in widespread use among Maori, and by 1860, Renata Tamakihikurangi of Ngati Kahungunu would go so far as to say to the European settlers of Hawke's Bay, "Just as you are all English, so we natives are all one. Maori is my name." In official usage, however, the word native was employed to describe the cabinet minister and government department responsible for Maori matters and the land court until 1946. The treaty also employed the term Pakeha to refer to Queen Victoria's non-Maori subjects in New Zealand. Use of this word in Maori to denote Europeans was current in the Bay of Islands by at least 1814, when the missionary William Hall reported that he had been referred to at Te Puna Pa as a rangatira Pakeha, a European gentleman. There is no evidence in this or any other instance in early literature that the term was derogatory. It was simply a necessary descriptive word to distinguish European from Maori, and it probably came from the pre-European word Pakeha, denoting mythical light-skinned beings. It may not have been universally popular in Maori from the beginning of Maori Pakeha contact. Some early references note the term tangata tipua, and in the far south, tangata pora, to describe Europeans, but use of the word Pakeha was widespread among Maori by the 1830s. The main reason for its spread, of course, was the growth of the settler population and the increase in the proportion of Maori who would have direct contact with Europeans. The number of Pakeha living in New Zealand in 1830 had been just over 300. Most of these settlers had come from Australia, some of them ex-convicts seeking to escape their penal pasts, and some traders working for Australian-based timber and flax operations. A smaller percentage included those who had jumped ship from vessels originating in Britain, the United States and France. The population of missionaries and their families came largely from England, the Anglicans and Wesleyans, or from France, the Catholics. The total number of Pakeha settlers in 1840 was a little over 2,000. By 1858 they would outnumber Maori by approximately 3,000, 59,000 to 56,000. And by 1881 there would be around 500,000 of them. What caused this massive removal of population from one side of the world to the other? In global terms, of course, the development of the new state of New Zealand in the second half of the 19th century was a subplot in the diaspora of Europeans that sent as many as 50 million people from the old world to the new over a period of 200 years. These were the settlers who created neo-Europes in North America, Australia and Southern Africa, taking with them the flora, fauna, agricultural and horticultural practices and architecture that enabled them to transform whole landscapes into a likeness of the places they had left behind. The forces which scattered them have been categorized by James Belich into those which pushed and those which pulled. The push, or dynamic of ejection, included such factors as European overpopulation, poverty, hunger, an inability to break out of class systems, and religious controversy or outright persecution. Scots who came to Otago and Southland from 1848, for example, were propelled largely by an urge to escape economic depression and its effects, and by the excoriating split between the Church of Scotland and Free Church Presbyterians. Thousands of Irish departures at about the same time were prompted by the devastating potato famines. The attraction lay in the promise of prosperity and healthier environments, prospects for social advancement without the hurdles of a class system, and, for investors, opportunities to enlarge capital. Much of the initial settlement of New Zealand in the 1840s was the result of private enterprise immigration company schemes. The British Colonial Office had been persuaded to accelerate its plans for the annexation of New Zealand, and William Hobson to proclaim sovereignty before the Treaty of Waitangi had finished its perambulations, because of two of these private schemes. One was French in origin and resulted in the establishment of the Nanto Bordelais colony at Akaroa in August 1840. Had Hobson not already acted 3 months earlier, this settlement might have resulted in part or the whole of the South Island being annexed by France. As things transpired, however, organised French colonization was confined to the small community, only 53 settlers in all, on Banks Peninsula, although individual Frenchmen and their families had found their way to such ports as the Bay of Islands and Tauranga. Because the inhabitants of Akaroa were nominally almost entirely Catholic, Bishop Pompallier established the first European station of his mission there in 1840, and for a short time it was a pleasant place for his culture-starved priests, and for the bishop himself, to renew their association with French cuisine, conversation and literature. Eventually, however, Pompallier closed the station as a mark of disgust at the religious apathy of the Akaroa colonists. A far more substantial scheme was the New Zealand Company settlement of Wellington, also established in 1840 on the shores of Port Nicholson. This was the brainchild of the mercurial Edward Gibbon Wakefield. Wakefield had been imprisoned for 3 years as a result of abducting the schoolgirl heiress Ellen Turner in 1826, and while he was incarcerated he formulated his famous theories for what he called systematic colonization. The principal aim of this scheme, David Hamer has written, was to provide a balance between capital and labour. Wakefield believed that to succeed, a colony had to attract capitalists, and that the way to do this was to ensure that labour would be available to work on and add value to the property in which they had invested. Land should be sold at a price beyond the means of labourers, but their migration could be encouraged by the expectation of one day buying land with their savings. Although the New Zealand Company was set up by well-heeled investors to apply these concepts to its New Zealand settlements, Wakefield himself was obliged to play a behind-the-scenes role because of the notoriety generated by the Ellen Turner episode. In that role he argued and charmed into cooperation an influential group of aristocrats and politicians, including the Earl of Durham, John George Lambton, Baron Peter, Sir William Molesworth, the brothers John and William Hutt, and others whose names would eventually grace New Zealand streets and towns. Two of the company's principal agents in New Zealand, however, would be Edward's brothers, William and Arthur Wakefield, in Wellington and Nelson respectively. Edward himself would not set foot in the country until 1853, whereupon he began a brief and disappointing political career. The Wakefields' plans for New Zealand sought to establish a better Britain, or a Britain of the South, in which English class distinctions were preserved, but where industrious artisans and farmers could more easily work their way towards prosperity and respectability. Company prospectuses and allied advertising told many lies about the nature of the new country, describing Wellington, for example, as a place of undulating plains suitable for the cultivation of grapevines, olives and wheat. By the time the truth was revealed, colonists had arrived and were unlikely to turn around at once and depart. And they were arriving in billowing numbers. Wellington had 2,500 European settlers by 1841 and 4,000 by 1843. Whanganui was founded as Peter, after one of the New Zealand Company's aristocratic directors, to provide additional land for the overflow of Wellington settlers and to supply the mother settlement with pigs, pork and potatoes. Nelson and New Plymouth were founded as further New Zealand Company settlements in 1841. All three would have serious difficulties with local Maori as a result of questionable land purchases. Two further ventures, the establishment of Dunedin as a Scottish Free Church settlement in 1848 and Christchurch as a Canterbury Association, Church of England settlement in 1850, were based on New Zealand company models and hence can be seen as offspring or beneficiaries of its major enterprises, which formally ceased when the company surrendered its charter to the Crown in 1850. Auckland alone of the main centres was established in 1840 and grew without organised immigration. Its prosperity was ensured by its location on an isthmus between two navigable harbours and by Hobson's decision to relocate the country's capital there from the Bay of Islands. While the New Zealand company settlements contributed only about 15,500 settlers to New Zealand's founding population, they were disproportionately influential on account of being their first and establishing the ethos of their cities, three of which, with Auckland, would become and remain the main centres and provide the foundation for the system of provincial government introduced in 1853. Christchurch, for example, would remain visibly English in character and appearance and in the manners of its citizenry for its first 100 years. And Dunedin, with its street names drawn from Edinburgh, its public buildings in stone and brick, and its scattering of Queen Anne towers, was still unmistakably Scottish more than 150 years after its foundation. No clear information is available on exactly what percentages of early immigrants were engaged in which occupations. But, as Janine Graham has noted, the New Zealand company sought to attract respectful, hard-working rural labourers and cultured men of capital as its two categories of first choice. The Canterbury settlement, closer to land immediately available for agriculture and horticulture, wanted industrious immigrants of the labouring class and small farmers, while the Marlborough province, soon after its establishment in 1860, sought ordinary farm labourers, carpenters and mechanics, navvies, bush hands, shepherds, miners, and domestic female servants. Shepherds were especially welcome if they brought their own dogs. Most female immigrants who were not wives or daughters came as domestic servants. In terms of national wealth, in the pastoral era of the 1850s and 1860s, the colony's basic economic unit was an efficiently managed sheep run of 10,000 acres or more. Such stations, predominantly in Hawke's Bay, Wairarapa, Canterbury and North Otago, formed a settled community of about a score, family, shepherds and station hands. I.R. Cooper, in The New Zealand Settler's Guide, assured readers in 1857 that those who arrive in the colony without capital will, if they enjoy good health, are sober and economical in their personal expenses, and are able and willing to work at any one trade, as farm servants, boatmen, shepherds or house servants, soon realize a sufficient capital to invest in land, cattle or sheep, and thus to render themselves and their children independent. Certainly a degree of adaptability and what might be regarded as upward social mobility is apparent in many individual families. The Olsons, for example, who came to Wellington in the 1850s as shoemakers, ran a hotel in Littleton in the 1860s, and then settled in Taranaki as landowners and farmed in the 1880s. And it was the opportunity to make such adjustments that drew many colonists out from the United Kingdom, where such mobility was more difficult to accomplish for economic and social reasons. Benjamin Shadbolt, transported in 1846 from Oxfordshire to Tasmania for burglary, won his ticket of leave in 1853, migrated to New Zealand in 1859 with sufficient capital to become, within a short period, a sawmiller, farmer, shopkeeper and publican on Banks Peninsula. By the time he died in 1862, at the early age of 57, he was a respected horse breeder and local body politician. His immediate descendants suppressed, or were never told about, the convict chapter of his life, which had enabled him to break out of rural poverty in England. Like the Olsons and Shadbolt, the largest number of immigrants in the first 50 years of European settlement of New Zealand, close to 50%, would come from England and Wales. The two countries are not distinguishable because early statistics lump them together. Evidence suggests strongly that the number of Welsh was considerably lower than that of English. Scots would make up the second biggest group, some 24%, in contrast to Britain itself, where they made up only 10% of the total population. Then came the Irish, whose numbers reached a peak of about 19% in the wake of the New Zealand gold rushes of the 1860s. Of the minority groups, the largest were Germans, who settled in particular around Nelson. Scandinavians, Poles, French and Italians made up most of the rest. Chinese immigrants too arrived to take advantage of the gold rushes, but were settled almost exclusively at first in Otago and Westland. Despite these minor cultural variegations, New Zealand acquired a distinctly British character as the 19th century advanced. Indeed, as commentators never tired of pointing out, the country became in some respects more British than Britain itself, especially in expressing loyalty to the Crown and its willingness to take part in imperial wars. As Bellich has argued, the British abroad tended to drop their narrower ethnic identities to form a new us while confronting a shared them, who in New Zealand were Maori and Catholic Irish. Like the racial identities to which it was closely related, Britishness was a cloak you put on when you went out. There was certainly far more mixing of ethnic and religious ingredients on the colonial frontier than there was at home. Dr. John Shaw, in A Gallop to the Antipodes, described his continual surprise at the manner in which people were living in New Zealand in the 1850s, apparently without many of the prejudices or preconceptions common to British people in Britain. He was also favourably impressed by the success of the mixed-race communities around shore whaling stations. He describes, for example, visiting John and Kurupa Davis, he an African-American whaler, she a former Moriori slave, near the guard station at Port Underwood. Their cottage was identical to others in such settlements. The roof, like that of a barn, was visible from the interior, from the rafters of which hung sickles, baskets, heads of Indian corn, bacon, knives, shears, and a razor. The sleeping apartment was separated by a wall which terminated halfway between the roof and the floor. On top dangled several clothes belonging to the lady of the establishment. There were no chairs, a long form being the only substitute. The floor consisted of terra firma covered with logs of wood, teapots, wooden casks, kettles, and a nail box. There was an imitation cupboard, placed at the top of which were some preserves. Lower down was a plate rack, scantily furnished, beneath which were hoes and hatchets. Across the chimney extended a spar on which were suspended pothooks and damp clothes waiting to be dried. The animals comprised of 4 cats, a few goats, numerous ducks and geese, cocks and hens. In came the husband, who most cordially shook me with his hand, as black as coal, with a face of the same complexion. We had a good repast of wild pig as usual, with some capital potatoes, finishing with a pipe. I was in the company of 2 individuals whose blood contained the savagism of 3 distinct races, in a miserable little cottage. But the attention and hospitality that I received from these poor people made me solemnly feel the truth and beauty of the scriptural declaration that God has made of one blood all the nations of the earth. Thomas Cholmondeley, writing in 1854, was more taken by what seemed, by comparison with Britain, a spirit of ecumenism. What then is the religious condition of the ordinary colonist? He finds himself struggling in a new country, not as he struggled in the old, in the midst of a town or village community trained and minded like himself. No, English, Irish, Welsh and Scottish are flung together. They compare thoughts, ways, actions and words. They discuss systems, exchange customs, sift, weigh and balance their arguments and positions one with another. From an old church catechism down to some new method of planting potatoes, nothing escapes. Even that most divisive element within British communities at home and abroad, the Protestant-Catholic split, was observed less in New Zealand than in Britain itself. A Catholic aristocrat, Charles Clifford, became first Speaker of the New Zealand Parliament in 1854. Another Catholic, Frederick Weld, became Premier in 1864. An English member of the Religious Tract Society who visited New Zealand in 1880 was alarmed by the extent of Catholic-Protestant interaction he found. One can't help feeling that the spirit of tolerance is somewhat carried to excess when one finds Protestants patronizing the Roman Catholic bazaar. One admires their love more than their wisdom, their heart more than their head. This early ecumenism worked to the benefit of such charitable aid workers as the French Catholic nun Suzanne Aubert, and set a healthy precedent for the colony, a sense in which it could indeed be viewed as a better Britain. But it would be infected by a virus of anti-Irish and consequent anti-Catholic feeling in the early decades of the 20th century. The rate of immigration increased considerably after the 1840s. In the 1850s it was fueled by provincial government schemes to entice new settlers in order to expand economic activity and to increase the political influence of the regions. In the 1860s the discovery of gold, first in Otago and then on the west coast of the South Island and finally on the Coromandel Peninsula in the north, increased the population influx in those areas substantially. In the same decade, military settlers were brought in from both Australia and Britain to defend colonists against perceived Maori challenges to British sovereignty and to settler safety. And finally, central government campaigns in the 1870s and 1880s, devised by the entrepreneurial Premier Julius Vogel, attracted immigrants at a rate that swamped all previous experience and campaigns. The net result was that between 1831 and 1881, the Pakeha population of New Zealand had increased by 50,000%. Of the 400,000 immigrants who came to the country, 300,000 remained there, while the number of births over the same period accounted for another 250,000 people. The character of New Zealand was changed forever. Those who had to relinquish ground, literally and metaphorically, for this influx of foreign people were the first New Zealanders, the indigenous Maori. And, in relinquishing ground, they would lose it.